When my only grandson got married, I stayed silent. I didn't say I had inherited $55 million from his late parents. They seated me at a corner table behind the columns where no one served me a drink. I watched him toast his bride while she whispered that I was just the old woman who raised him. That night, they left me outside in the cold. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just smiled. But what happens when the woman they buried in silence is the one who holds the power to everything they wanted? I sat in the very last row, not because I came late. I had been there since the morning helping the florist who didn't even know who I was. I just didn't want to make a fuss. It was my grandson's wedding day after all. The sun was warm over Carmel Beach. The chairs were set neatly in rows, all white linen and blush flowers. Every seat had a name. Mine didn't. I asked one of the ushers, and he pointed vaguely toward the back. I sat down without saying a word. Sometimes silence is louder than any protest. Brennan stood at the altar in his custom blue suit. He looked handsome. My heart tightened just looking at him. I raised him since he was 8. After the crash that took his parents, it was just the two of us. I packed his school lunches, sat through every dental appointment, stayed up helping with college essays. But here I was, a stranger at his wedding. When he spoke into the mic, thanking those who shaped him into the man he was, he named his coach, his college mentor, even Sierra's mother. He paused before moving on. There was no mention of me. Sierra, glowing in her designer gown, leaned over at one point during the ceremony. She touched my shoulder, smiled with those camera-ready lips, and whispered, "It's so special that you're here, Miss Forsyth." Miss, not Grandma, not even Marlene. I nodded, smiled, clapped at all the right times. I even helped gather gift bags as they moved guests toward the reception. No one looked at me twice. The seat marked for grandparents near the sweetheart table. It had Sierra's grandmother. The other chair was empty. Brennan didn't notice. Or maybe he did. I stayed until the last dance, then slipped away while the DJ played their song. No one waved goodbye. Driving home that night, I kept one hand on the steering wheel and one on the clutch of my purse. Not out of habit, just grounding myself. I tried not to cry, but I did quietly, the kind that makes your chest ache, but not your eyes swell. If you've ever been forgotten by the very person you love the most, maybe you understand that kind of silence. It isn't loud. It's hollow. And that was just the beginning. I didn't know it yet, but something worse was waiting for me behind a leather folder on a marble table. Something with my name and a signature I never gave. 3 days after the wedding, Brennan called and asked if I could stop by their new place in Pacific Grove. He said there were a few things he wanted to go over regarding the estate. His tone was calm, polite. I told him I'd bring lemon bars. Their condo sat at the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac, modern and cold like the shows in lifestyle magazines. Sierra opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She wore one of those neutral beige sets influencers always post in. Her nails matched her coffee mug. Everything about her looked staged. Brennan was in the kitchen. He didn't hug me, just motioned toward the marble island. A folder waited there, sleek and black with a silver clip. I set the lemon bars beside it. No one touched them. He poured himself a drink. Still not looking at me, he said they'd been going over the finances and wanted to streamline things for the future. Then he finally looked up and said, "The trust needed a small update. Nothing big. Just some signatures to make the process smoother." I kept my hands folded. I asked him what kind of update. He said I'd still be involved, but more as a figurehead. His words, not mine. That it would be easier if he and Sierra had decision-making authority since, in his words, I might not want the stress of all that money at my age. He chuckled when he said it, like we were just having a chat over coffee. Then he opened the folder and slid the papers toward me. I didn't pick them up right away. The top page was labeled Trust Reassignment Addendum. That was the first red flag. I managed estates at the nursing home for years. The language was clean corporate, but too smooth, a little too practiced. I flipped through the pages slowly. 3 pages in, I froze. My name was there, my signature, my handwriting, but I had never signed that document. My stomach dropped. It was neat, precise. A copy of how I signed birthday cards, letters, everything. But it wasn't mine. I looked at Brennan. He was watching me. His face was unreadable. Sierra was on her phone, scrolling with one hand, sipping with the other, like none of this was unusual. I closed the folder gently, told them I'd need time to review. Brennan shrugged. Sierra said to take my time. On the drive home, I kept seeing that signature, the loops of the F, the way the R curved into the Y, identical to mine. But I had never held that pen. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't confused anymore. I was angry, not loud or shaking. A quiet, measured anger, the kind that lets you sleep just fine but wakes you up at 4 a.m. with clarity. Someone forged my name. And if they had the nerve to do that, I needed to know what else they were planning because this wasn't just a trick. This was a plan. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I just sat at the dining table sipping cold chamomile and staring at the soft light pooling through the window. The silence in my house was heavy, that kind of silence you only get when trust has been broken. I kept the folder in front of me. I hadn't touched the pages again. I didn't need to. My name forged on legal documents was burned into my mind. It was more than betrayal. It was theft dressed up in a smile-impressed suit. Around 3 a.m., I finally got up and went to the closet in the spare room, the one I hadn't opened in years. Inside was the old metal filing box Mark gave me after the funeral. I remembered the weight of it in my hands. Back then, I was still numb, grieving, trying to be strong for Brennan. Mark's lawyer said it was just documents, instructions, in case something happened. At the time, I didn't have the heart to open it. I tucked it away and focused on raising Brennan. I brought the box to the kitchen table and took a deep breath before opening it. The lock clicked open like it had been waiting. Inside were rows of manila folders, tabs faded with time. One of them was labeled with Brennan's full name. I opened it. Inside, nestled between custody paperwork and school records, was a navy blue envelope. It had no label, no address, just my name in Mark's handwriting. I held it for a long moment before sliding the letter out. It was short. Mark never used more words than he needed. If Brennan ever turns, you'll know. The original trust is on the USB. You're the trustee. You decide everything. Protect him if you can, but protect yourself if you must. I held the USB in my hand. Small blue, the kind that looked outdated now, but once held everything. I had never used it, never even noticed it, until now. I booted up my old laptop, the one I only used for tax season and the occasional recipe search. The USB clicked into place, and after a few seconds, a folder popped up labeled for Mom. Inside were PDF copies of the original trust documents. I scrolled slowly. Everything was there. The notarized pages. My name as sole trustee. Full discretion until Brennan reached 30. 30. Not 24. Not when he got married. Not when Sierra fluttered into his life. There was also a clause I didn't expect. Distribution of any assets is contingent upon the heir demonstrating maturity, gratitude, and a continued relationship with the appointed guardian. I leaned back in my chair. This wasn't just about money. Mark had seen the cracks before they even formed. He hadn't just trusted me to raise Brennan. He had trusted me to guard the family's legacy, and he had built a wall around it to protect us both. I sat there until the sun broke over the neighbor's roofline. Everything looked the same outside. The garden, the quiet street, the light fog rolling in from the bay. But inside, something had shifted. I knew the truth now, not the one Brennan tried to hand me on glossy paper, but the truth Mark left behind. Sealed in a forgotten file wrapped in trust and foresight. And I knew for the first time since that wedding was going to do. The next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Evelyn Doss. She used to be our estate lawyer back when Mark and I ran the transitional care home in Monterey. She retired after her second husband passed, moved inland, and started growing heirloom tomatoes. But she was sharp, always had been. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice hadn't changed. I told her I needed an extra pair of eyes on a document. She didn't ask why, Just said to bring everything I had and come by afternoon. I printed both versions of the trust, the forged one Brennan had given me, the original one from the USB. I also copied Mark's letter, slipped them into a slim folder, and tucked it under my arm like I used to do with patient charts. Evelyn lived in a little stucco house with clay pots lining the walkway. Her kitchen smelled like rosemary and coffee. She sat at the table, put on her reading glasses, and went through the papers line by line. When she was done, she didn't speak for a moment. Then, she tapped the forged trust with one finger and said, "This document is a problem." She pointed out how the signature page wasn't properly witnessed. The notary seal was digital but expired. The formatting was off in subtle ways that only someone in law would notice. And then she looked at me and said what I already knew. "That's not your signature." I nodded. She leaned back, took off her glasses, and told me the options. I could take it to probate court, report the forgery, get Brennan and whoever else helped him investigated, possibly charged. But that route would be public, long, ugly. Or I could use what I knew and pressure them quietly, file a notice of fraud through the trust registrar, lock the assets, force a legal review, and in the meantime, gather more proof. I sat with that for a while. Then I asked if she'd be willing to act as my counsel again. She smiled, said she had been waiting for something interesting to do. By the time I got home, I had a plan. I went to the small safe in my bedroom closet. Inside were old bank statements, my will, and a tiny voice recorder. Mark used to carry it during family meetings at the care home. Said people remember things better when they know they're being recorded. I charged it overnight. That weekend, Brennan called again. He asked if I had reviewed the paperwork. Said Sierra's cousin was an estate planner and could help explain anything I didn't understand. His tone was syrupy, but I heard the tightness under it. I told him I'd be happy to come over and talk it through. He sounded pleased. Sunday afternoon, I walked into their condo with a Tupperware of potato salad and the recorder tucked in the side pocket of my purse. I switched it on before ringing the bell. Brennan met me at the door, all smiles. Sierra was in the kitchen uncaulking wine. We sat at the table. They laid out the same documents again, only this time, Sierra spoke more. She used words like streamlining efficiency, long-term vision. She kept glancing at Brennan like prompting him. Then calmly I asked about the notary, the witness signatures, the digital seal. Brennan's face changed just slightly. A blink too slow, a pause too long. Sierra cut in, saying the document had been handled by a paralegal who was now out of state. She spoke fast. I let her finish. Then I smiled and said I'd need everything in writing. The recorder clicked off in my purse 2 minutes later. Back home, I backed up the audio on 3 separate drives. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just started documenting. And that was the beginning of something they never saw coming. Monday morning, I drove into town and made 2 quiet stops. First was at the post office where I sent certified copies of the audio file and both trust documents to a secure box Evelyn had set up through her old firm. Second was to a print shop tucked behind the bakery where I had the pages copied, dates stamped, and bound. I asked the young man at the counter to be careful. He didn't ask why, just nodded and handed everything back in a manila envelope. From there, I went to the registrar's office. It was quiet. The woman behind the glass window looked up and smiled as I slid the folder toward her. I told her I needed to file a notice of suspected fraud, related to a living trust. Her smile didn't falter, but her hands paused just slightly before taking the papers. She took my ID, asked a few routine questions, then walked everything into the back. 20 minutes later, a supervisor came out. He wore a brown tie and spoke in calm, measured tones. Told me the process would trigger an internal review, that the estate would be frozen until the dispute was resolved. No changes, no disbursements, no activity. I said that would be fine. By the time I walked out, the coastal breeze had picked up. I took a long breath before getting in my car. The air felt different, like a shift had taken place. That afternoon, I sat in my sunroom with a pen and a stack of notes. I began listing everything I knew, everything I had, every call Brennan made since the wedding. The way Sierra always jumped in when details came up. The sudden push to finalize paperwork, the name of the so-called paralegal she mentioned. I wrote it all down, every pattern, every slip in their stories. I also emailed a quiet request to a friend of Evelyn's in the local bar association. She specialized in document verification. I sent her a scanned copy of the signature page, told her I believed it had been forged. While waiting, I started going through old financial records. Not just mine, but the ones Mark kept. He was thorough. Everything had a copy. He left notes and margins, little arrows pointing to what mattered. He had made a separate folder labeled Future Considerations. Inside were breakdowns of projected costs, tax implications, and something I hadn't expected. A letter to Brennan. It wasn't signed. It wasn't dated, just a draft. But the message was clear. He had intended to pass on the estate, but only when Brennan proved he understood the weight of it. That money was not for show, not to impress people or buy attention, that it was to be handled with humility. With respect. I stared at that letter for a long time. Then I folded it and placed it beside the voice recorder. Late that evening, Evelyn called. Her voice was steady. She said the bar association contact had flagged the signature as highly suspect. A full verification would take time, but early indicators leaned toward manipulation. I thanked her, hung up, sat in the stillness. This wasn't just about trust anymore. It was about values, about legacy, about the line between guidance and control. And it was time Brennan understood that line had been crossed quietly, deliberately, and now officially. The house was silent. Outside, the wind moved through the rosemary bush near the window. I poured myself a glass of water, and I waited. 2 days later, Brennan showed up unannounced. He knocked twice, then opened the front door like he still lived there. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. He walked into the kitchen, looked around like he was checking for someone else, then gave me that tired smile he always used when he was trying to disarm me. He said he was just stopping by to see how I was doing, that Sierra was worried I hadn't been sleeping. I nodded and offered him coffee. He declined, said he didn't have much time, just wanted to touch base. He stayed standing while I sat at the kitchen table. My copy of the trust was still there closed. So was the recorder, though this time I hadn't bothered to turn it on. I didn't need a record today. Today wasn't about proof. Brennan said he understood the paperwork might have been overwhelming, that maybe I felt rushed, but he hoped I realized this wasn't about cutting me out. It was about making things easier for everyone. He used the word efficient again, said Sierra had friends who could manage the portfolio better than any private firm. Said they were looking out for the future. I asked him if that's what Mark would have wanted. Just like that. Calm, neutral. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the window, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. It was thick. My name was written on the front, but not in his handwriting. He slid it across the table, told me it was a revised copy, something more in line with what we had all originally agreed to, that it was a show of good faith. I didn't touch it. Just looked at it. He watched me for a moment, then exhaled and stepped back. Said he didn't want us to fight. That family was more important than paperwork. He said all the right words, just not with the right face. After he left, I opened the envelope. It was exactly what I expected, a more polished forgery. This one had my signature on multiple pages, cleaner, as if they'd hired someone new. But it was still a lie, just a better dressed one. I called Evelyn. She told me not to react. Not yet. Let them walk further into the mess they were building. Every change they made without my consent, every attempt to redo the forgery only gave us more to use. That night, I made another list. This time, not just what I knew, but what they didn't. They didn't know the estate had already been flagged. They didn't know I had recorded 2 full meetings. They didn't know Evelyn had looped in a financial oversight officer. And most importantly, they didn't know I had already rewritten the final clause of the trust, something Mark had empowered me to do. It was a clause that placed a temporary lock on all distributions for the next 5 years unless the trustee me determined otherwise. I filed that clause the next morning. Brennan and Sierra were playing a game with the rules. What they didn't realize was that I had written the rule book. I wasn't planning revenge. I was restoring balance one signature at a time. A week passed in near silence. Brennan didn't call. Sierra didn't send follow-up emails. No one dropped by. And yet I knew they were busy. Not the kind of busy you brag about. The kind of busy where phone calls are made in low voices and plans are revised behind closed doors. I spent those days quietly. On the outside, everything looked unchanged. I watered the porch plants. I returned a library book. I walked down to the co-op to buy brown rice and figs. But inside, I was organizing every thread. Each morning, I reviewed my folder, the forged documents, Evelyn's notes, the signed confirmation from the registrar that the freeze was officially in place. Each page was another layer of quiet defense. Then on Friday, I got the envelope. No return address, no note, just my name printed in stiff black letters. Inside was a wedding invitation. Brennan and Sierra were hosting a reception, not for themselves. They had already been married. This was for Sierra's extended family, most of whom lived upstate. A vineyard estate printed menus valet parking, and under RSVP, there was a handwritten line. "We hope you'll say a few words." I stared at that line for a long time. This wasn't a peace offering. It was a test. They thought I was softened, worn down. Maybe they believed I wanted to be included so badly that I'd play along, even if it meant overlooking everything they'd done. I didn't rip the invitation up. I didn't throw it away. I pinned it to the fridge with a blue magnet shaped like a watering can. Then I sat down and started writing. I didn't write a speech. I wrote a list. One for Brennan, one for Sierra, not to send, just for me. A list of things they used to be and what they had become. For Brennan, the boy who brought me cereal when I was sick. The boy who cried when his frog died and asked if I thought it had a soul. Now, a man who smiled while handing me a document he knew was fake. For Sierra, the girl with the loud laugh who brought flowers the first time she visited. The one who called me Miss May out of respect. Now, the woman who tried to erase my name from my husband's legacy. They weren't villains in a story. They were people who made choices. Choices they believed would stay hidden. Choices that might have worked if I had stayed the version of myself they remembered. Quiet, forgiving, willing to believe the best. But I had changed. That Sunday, I called Evelyn. Told her I was attending the event. She hesitated, then said she understood. She reminded me not to confront them in public. Not yet. Just observe. Let the distance speak louder than any accusation. So, I bought a dress. Navy. Modest. The kind that blends in but photographs well. I polished Mark's old watch and wore my mother's pin on the collar. When I arrived at the vineyard, the staff greeted me with polite confusion. My name was not on the formal seating chart, but Sierra came rushing over. Cheeks pink, arms wide, and said they had saved me a seat with the family. She kissed my cheek. Her perfume was sharp, manufactured sweetness. We walked together past rows of white chairs and long tables with calligraphy name cards. They sat me next to a woman from Sierra's side who had never heard of me. It didn't bother me. I just smiled, ate the salad, watched. No speech was requested that day, no toast from Grandma May. Just polite smiles and careful glances. Sierra's father gave a long, terrary tribute. Brennan nodded along like a beautiful son-in-law, and I stayed quiet because sometimes silence is louder than anything else. 3 days after the vineyard reception, a certified letter arrived. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize out of Sacramento. The envelope was thick. Inside was a formal request for clarification of trustee status and a proposed amendment to the estate distribution. It was written in polite language, dressed in legal phrasing, but its message was clear. They were challenging the trust. The timing was strategic, just enough time after the reception to seem unrelated. But I knew better. This was their next move. I called Evelyn. She asked for the firm's name and paused for a long second before responding. Said the attorney listed was known for representing heirs in high-value estate disputes, the kind of lawyer who didn't get involved unless someone promised a substantial payout. I thanked her, then hung up and sat on the porch for an hour. This wasn't just about Brennan anymore. It was Sierra. She had gone from subtle manipulation to outright pressure. If they had involved an attorney, it meant they were running out of patience or confidence or both. That night, I pulled out a fresh notebook and wrote down the timeline again. Not just events, but behaviors. The moment Sierra stopped calling me Miss May. The first time Brennan referred to the trust as his future instead of our family's security. Every visit that shifted in tone. Every detail that now felt like a breadcrumb. I added one more item to the bottom of the list. The vineyard event, the fact that I was excluded from the official seating, but paraded past the family as if nothing was wrong. That was performance, not apology. The next morning, I returned to Evelyn's office. She met me with coffee and a file folder already in hand. She told me quietly that the investigator she'd referred had finished their early analysis. The second forged document, the one Brennan delivered in person, had not only a faked signature, but also metadata indicating it had been drafted from an IP address linked to Sierra's firm. It wasn't conclusive, but it connected dots. Evelyn leaned in and said we had enough to make things very uncomfortable for them if we wanted. But the next steps would define everything. Either I filed formal charges or I sent a message through other means. I asked what she had in mind. She slid over a template. A letter addressed not to Brennan or Sierra, but to the law firm. It politely declined their request for amendments attached documentation to proving forgery and included notice that any future correspondence would be routed through legal counsel with potential criminal review under consideration. I read the letter slowly, then signed it. Evelyn gave a firm nod and said she'd send it by morning. That evening, I sat alone in my den, surrounded by silence. The kind of silence that came not from absence, but from decision. A stillness that carried weight. I took out the original USB and backed it up again. One to a cloud folder, one to a new thumb drive. Then I placed both into separate sealed envelopes and labeled them in the event of dispute. Before I went to bed, I called the county clear, asked to schedule a quiet review of the trust file just to make sure nothing else had slipped through unnoticed. They gave me a date. I circled it in red on my calendar. No confrontation, no raised voices, just steady hands and clear records. Let them scramble. Let them consult. Let them talk in hushed tones over wine glasses and legal pads. I was done pretending to be the grandmother they remembered. I was the trustee now, fully, calmly, without apology. On a crisp Wednesday morning, just a week after Evelyn sent the formal response to Brennan's lawyer, I hosted a breakfast at the house. Nothing dramatic, just coffee, eggs, and a quiet table set for 3. Brennan, Sierra, and me. I told them it was important we speak face to face. No lawyers, no assumptions, just clarity. They arrived late. Brennan looked tense. Sierra wore oversized sunglasses even though we were indoors. I offered coffee. They declined. We sat at the dining table, the same one where Mark and I used to play dominoes on Sunday afternoons. I let the silence linger until Brennan finally broke it. He asked if I was reconsidering. If maybe things had gotten too complicated. He spoke softly, carefully. Sierra said little, only nodding at the right moments. I told them calmly that I had reviewed everything, that I understood exactly what they had attempted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply laid out facts. I said the original trust remained legally intact and unmended, that all attempts to alter or replace it without my consent were invalid and now part of an official record. I told them I knew about the forgery, both versions. I told them I had evidence verified by professionals. Their faces changed, but not in sync. Brennan went pale. Sierra tightened her jaw. She crossed her arms, leaned back, said, I was misunderstanding. I told her there was no misunderstanding, that the registrar had frozen the estate, that the law firm had received Evelyn's notice, and that the forged files had been archived under my directive for future proceedings. I paused. Then I said something they didn't expect. I told them I wasn't pressing charges. Not yet. Sierra straightened. Brennan blinked. I said that what I cared about now wasn't punishment. It was precedent and clarity. I told them that the trust would remain under my control for the remainder of my life, that the clause freezing all distributions would remain in place, that any future considerations, gifts, or transfers would be evaluated on merit, not entitlement. I looked Brennan in the eye and told him that love wasn't transactional, that respect wasn't inherited with dollars. He didn't answer. Then I told them something else, that I had begun preparations to restructure a portion of the estate, not to revoke it, but to convert it into a foundation, one that would honor Mark's values: care, community, accountability. Brennan asked who would run it. I said I would for now. Then a board, a trusted team, people chosen not by blood, but by capacity and character. Sierra stood up, said nothing, just stood. Brennan followed. They left without touching the coffee. Later that evening, Evelyn called. She asked how it went. I told her it was done. She asked if I felt resolved. I said I didn't feel lighter, but I felt clearer. That night, I opened Mark's old journal, the one he kept during the early days of our home. On the inside cover, he had written a quote from a nurse he'd admired. When you care for people, you don't owe them comfort, you owe them truth. I closed the book, sat quietly in that thought. The truth had finally been said, not with fire, but with finality. A week passed after the breakfast. No calls, no letters, no visits. Brennan and Sierra had gone quiet, not the silence of peace, but the silence of recalculating. The kind of pause people take when the story they wrote in their heads starts to unravel. Meanwhile, I moved forward. I began sorting through Mark's archives. Not just financial records, but his writings, speeches, photos, pieces of a life he had lived with dignity. We had once talked about creating something permanent with it, a legacy beyond the estate. I realized now was the time. With Evelyn's help, I drafted a charter for a community trust. Its mission was simple: to fund caregiver scholarships, support elder care initiatives, and provide legal guidance for women navigating inheritance abuse, all funded by a portion of the assets Brennan thought he was entitled to. I didn't name the foundation after myself or even Mark. I named it after my grandmother, the woman who raised me when my own parents were too broken to try. Her name was Elise. Strong, quiet, steady. By the end of the month, we filed incorporation papers. The foundation became real. News spread slowly, first through community channels, then through one of the local newspapers that picked up the story after Evelyn gave them a gentle nudge. They didn't publish details about the estate or the dispute, just a short feature on a retired nurse who had converted her husband's trust into a nonprofit that would outlive them both. I clipped the article and saved it in a leather folder marked private. 2 days later, I received a package. No return address again. This time it was a single envelope hand-sealed thick with tension. Inside were 2 things, a typed letter from Brennan and a check. The letter said he understood now that mistakes had been made, that lines were crossed, that decisions were influenced by fear, by pride, by people who didn't understand the weight of legacy. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer than I ever expected. The check was made out to the Elise Foundation, $100,000. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just placed the check between the article and the charter papers and set the folder back in the drawer. That night, I walked down to the harbor. The air was cool and the lights from the boats shimmered on the water like small truths refusing to be buried. I sat on the same bench where Mark and I used to share ice cream in the summer. He once told me that money was a tool, a hammer in the right hands, a weapon in the wrong ones. For a while, I wondered if I had lost him in all this. If the fight had made me smaller, meaner. But sitting there, I realized something else. This wasn't about money. Not really. It was about what gets passed down that isn't written in a will. Kindness, boundaries, decency. Those are the legacies that matter. And now, at last, mine was beginning. Autumn settled over the town like a worn quilt. Leaves drifted down in quiet swirls and the days grew shorter. I found myself drawn to the same routines each morning: a cup of black tea, a short walk past the garden beds, and an hour spent at the foundation's desk reviewing letters from women across the state. Most of them were handwritten. Stories of daughters cut out of wills, mothers pushed aside in favor of new spouses, grandmothers left with nothing after decades of sacrifice. I read every one, not as a judge, not even as a savior. Just as someone who finally understood what it meant to be unseen for too long, I started to keep a journal again, not for memories, but for clarity. Each entry held a few lines, not just about estate law or trusts or court filings, but about silence, about strength, about how a person could lose so much and still find peace in small things. One entry read, "Grief is not the end. Sometimes it's the soil where something else grows." By November, the Elise Foundation held its first public event, a small gathering at the community center. No press, no photographers, just a dozen women seated in folding chairs, sipping cider, sharing stories. One had just won back rights to her home. Another had left a family that treated her like a burden. We didn't offer solutions. We offered presence. That was enough. Brennan never called again. Sierra sent a brief email wishing me health around Thanksgiving. I responded with a polite note. Nothing more. The house was quieter than ever, but it didn't feel empty. In the evenings, I played old records, cooked soups from Mark's recipe box, watched shadows stretch long across the kitchen floor, and thought not of what I had lost, but of what I had built in its place. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was steadiness. It was mine. And I knew as the year wound down that the work wasn't over. But the storm had passed, and I had weathered it without losing myself. Winter came soft that year. No storms, just a quiet hush over everything. I spent most mornings at the foundation, most evenings at home with my routines. Life had settled into something gentle, something earned. One afternoon in December, I received a letter, handwritten, shaky script, from Brennan's first-grade teacher, now retired. She said she'd seen the article about the foundation. Said she remembered me how I used to wait by the chain-link fence with a thermos of soup and an extra pair of gloves. Said she always knew Brennan was loved. I folded the letter and placed it in the same folder as the check. I didn't cry, but I sat with it for a long time. Later that week, I received the final confirmation from the Register. The Elise Foundation had cleared the full endowment threshold. It was official now, protected, untouchable. It would serve long after I was gone. On Christmas Eve, I lit a candle in the window. Not for anyone else, just for me. A small flame for the woman I used to be. For the one who stayed quiet too long, for the one who finally spoke. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't proud. I was simply whole. And sometimes that's all we can hope for. If you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, like the years you gave were overlooked or erased, this story is for you. Sometimes silence isn't peace. It's just the space before you choose yourself again. And if this story reminded you of someone you love or maybe even your own path, I hope you carry that strength with you. Thank you for listening. You're not alone.